Welcome to a video about Steve Crane, everyone's favorite character from The Haunting of Hill House. This video is going to contain spoilers about The Haunting of Hill House. Also, I was just kidding, everybody hates Steve Crane, but I don't, so I want to talk about that. So I'm going to start by talking about who everyone seems to like and why I think they like them. So, my first observation is that everyone seems to like the youngest three Crane siblings a lot more than the oldest two. And I think this has to do with how sympathetic the younger three are in comparison to the older two. Because all the siblings share this kind of trauma A plot of, oh no, we have a dead mom who died in a spooky house. But they all have like traumatic B plots that differ between siblings. So, for example, Nell has a dead husband. She gets killed by the house. Bad. Luke struggles with addiction. That's rough. Theo is gay. Thank you. And she has the hand thing, which is like a metaphor for repression or something. These are all very sympathetic because they're tragedies from an external force. The siblings can't control what's happening to them. Meanwhile, the oldest two are assholes. Shirley cheats on her husband. She's screaming about the blood money. And then Steve lies to his wife constantly and is just like, it's on site with anyone in his family, I'm pretty sure. I think something's up. The tags on Tumblr for The Haunting of Hill House. You see a lot of gift sets of Nell and Theo specifically because we do it for the girls and the gays. But, you know, sometimes you see Luke thrown in with Nell, or someone's like, oh, I love Luke, and Peter Quint is a bastard. I hate that man. And this lumping together of Hugh and Steve is very important to the rest of this video because it's the starting point for why I like Steve. I like to overanalyze mediocre fictional white men with a bit of trauma. And Steve falls right into that. And also, I have a bit of trauma, so we can project. So I feel like my main reason for loving Steve Crane is that we both have shitty qualities that we can blame a bit on our parents. That's very relatable. A lot of people have shitty things that they inherited from their parents. But this is kind of overshadowed by the fact that Steve is an asshole to a lot of his family members who are much more relatable because not only do they have that trauma A plot of, oh my god, dead mom, but they have trauma B plots like, oh, dead husband too. It's much easier to sympathize with than, I lied to my wife and she's mad at me. I think what's important is that Steve is an asshole because he's a skeptic. And I think he inherits this from Hugh because he seems to spend more time with Hugh as a child than he does with Olivia. And Hugh is definitely the more pragmatic of the parents. Meanwhile, Steve's siblings spend more time with Olivia. So while Steve's siblings have kind of grown up with this bit of spiritualism, Steve has more inherited skepticism. Like, for example, Steve and Hugh, when they're in the basement, are using fans to try to get rid of that black mold. That black mold is a symbol of, oh, hungry evil ghost house is getting more hungry and evil. Steve and Hugh are two characters that are trying to solve a spiritual problem with a pragmatic solution, and it doesn't work. So then Olivia dies, and Hugh leaves Steve with this skepticism. And then Hugh comes back when Steve is an adult, and Hugh goes, bro, why the fuck don't you believe in ghosts yet? And this is completely unreasonable because Hugh has left Steve alone to figure out what happened to his mother without the spiritual lens that his siblings have. So naturally, Steve, instead of going, oh, the ghost got her, he says, Mom was mentally ill. And I don't think it's reasonable to hold this incorrect assessment against Steve, because this story is a metaphor. And if you were to remove the ghosts from this story and you removed the entire metaphor, you would be left with the Crane family is a family riddled with trauma and mental illness. So even though Steve isn't right in the context of our story, Steve would be right in real life. At least to me he would, because I don't believe in ghosts. But also, please hold the lying to his wife for years thing against Steve, because that was a shitty move. But speaking of shitty, let's talk a little bit more about Hugh. Hugh never gives his children the full story of what happened the night Liv died. He doesn't tell them how she was acting before he took them all to the motel. And I think this is a very important piece of information, especially for Hugh. I believe that this is really what pushed Hugh over the edge of ghosts don't exist, my wife is sick, to oh my god, ghosts exist and they killed my wife. And I think without this piece of information, the turn Steve sees in his father is very unfounded. He starts to distrust his father's judgment. So it makes sense that when Steve's siblings start telling him about these ghost stories, Steve doesn't believe it, because they were very young when all this happened, and they were very strongly influenced by a man that Steve doesn't trust. And then Hugh keeps telling Steve that Steven has never understood Hill House. And I think this is a very unreasonable gripe to have with Steve, because Hugh hasn't told him the full story. It's very hard to understand a story if you don't have all the major plot points. And so it feels like Steve is this man from our reality who gets dropped into a ghost metaphor, and then for 25 years everyone's like, bro, why the fuck don't you think you're in a ghost metaphor? When they should have just told him from day one, hey, we're in a ghost metaphor. They could have given him a lot of information. Hugh specifically could have given him the information Steven needed to make that mental jump from mental illness to, oh my god, ghosts. And then Hugh leaves Steve in charge of the house. An hour after saying to Steve, you've never understood this house and it's gonna kick your ass. And that's kind of shitty. But it says more about Hugh than Steve, so I won't really get into that. Steve Crane is an asshole. But I think when you look at it, that shittiness doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Steve Crane was raised by a father who I think tried his best but ultimately misses the mark. And Hugh is so wrapped up in his own problems that he fails to notice that he holds some responsibility for the things he sees and doesn't like in Steve. And I think something that a lot of us can relate to is this lack of self-awareness in parents, of the fact that they have influenced you in a negative way. And this creates a resentment in the child that they project onto the parent, and the parent projects back onto the child in this cycle. It's a very traumatic cycle, and that does reflect the themes of The Haunting of Hill House. This is Steve's trauma. And I think that trauma is a lot less apparent than it is in Steve's siblings, who are more popular with the fan base. But I think the trauma's there, and I think it's still very relatable if that's the story you're looking to get out of The Haunting of Hill House. Also, the vicious cycle that Hugh and Steve get caught in is ultimately resolved by Hugh dying? I have some problems with the way the final episode fits in thematically with the rest of the show. But let's get 69,000 likes and I'll talk about that. Yeehaw!